What's up, people? I'm Shaggy, the Opinionated Hippie, and today I'm going to be reviewing or ranking according to my favorite Emerson, Lake, and Palmer's albums. 10 of them, all the studio ones, and I am including pictures at an exhibition because you have to include pictures at an exhibition, even though it is live. It's all new material at the time, and it just feels canon. It feels as canon as any other studio album of any other artist. How do we get to Emerson, Lake, and Palmer from Zappa? Well, there's a lot of ways, mainly through the prog rock tree. But the one I'm going to go with is when Flo and Eddie were in the band, they did something called the Dr. John routine with Zappa, where they would like make fun of Dr. John and do like a little Dr. John jam. You can hear that on a couple boots. Anyways, it's out there. Emerson, Lake and Palmer has an album called Brain Salad Surgery, and there is a line in a Dr. John song. What song is it? It's a pretty famous song. It's not the. Is it the right time? Must have been the right place. One of those Dr. John songs has the line "Brain Salad Surgery" in it, and so the theory is that Emerson, Lake and Palmer stole the title from Dr. John. Whether or not they did, Dr. John uses brain salad surgery, Emerson, Lake and Palmer uses the thing, and Frank Zappa makes fun of them. Plus, you can go through the Prog family tree: Carl Palmer, Asia, yes, Owner of a Lonely Heart, Bamboozled by Love, Greg Lake, King Crimson, Adrian Belew. I'm not sure there's an Emerson connection that's direct. I'm sure somewhere through Emerson's The Nice or somewhere there's a connection, but also I would put maybe Emerson and Frank almost. I would put Frank higher in my like ranking of all-time great musicians, but there's sort of a driven purpose to both of those artists that make them sort of singular in their intensity. And I would rank Emerson up there as one of those like sort of all-time great musical figures. What he did with the keyboard. Nobody else was stabbing their keyboards with knives. I mean, come on. Mad props for that. Didn't see Tony Banks. They had a song called The Knife, and I never saw Tony Banks stab his keyboard. So anyways, never been a huge Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan, to be honest. Out of all the great prog rock bands of the 70s, I never really had that phase where I was intensely into them and did a deep dive and collected stuff. But I've always enjoyed them. They've always been there, and I've always just really liked them. And I do think they have one album that gets universally just ridiculed that isn't as bad as people say it is. It's not going to be high on this list, but it's not as bad as people say it is. So anyways, that's all I got. Let's do them. 10 to 1. I'll put the list up on the screen at the end for those of you that can't remember stuff but want to see it all in its totality. And then at the end, you tell me your list. But anyways, here we go. Oh yeah, they're one of the great prog rock groups of all time, if you didn't know that. I would say they are in many ways, the definition of progressive rock, whether that's good or bad or indulgent or like everything they did was progressive rock, like definitively. I'm not saying they were the best at it. I have more other favorites. I would understand why people would say they were the best at it, but they knew how to live the big prog rock star life on stage and through their albums, and I have much respect for all of their indulgences. Didn't always pay off, but much respect. And I'm going to have way too much to say about Works Volume 1, so let's get on with the list. On to number 10 and 9. First off, can we just acknowledge that their album cover game is either the best ever or the worst ever? You can decide based on those last two where we are now. But these are their last two albums. Number 10, their last studio album, their ninth. Number 9, their 8th studio album, their second to last. They're both, the production on them, everything wrong with the late 80s, mid to late 80s, early 90s. So many great prog rock bands, or even bands from the 70s trying to make a name for themselves in the 80s and early 90s just fell victim to horrible sounding production. I especially don't understand how someone like Palmer or Bruford and other bands, how these incredible drummers can let their drums sound as just sterile and dead and lifeless and just And so personally, like with my experience having grown up through the 80s and 90s, and I probably per second of my life absorbed more music in like those 10 years than any other 10 years. if I was introduced to an album in the 80s and 90s and it has a horrible, horrible production sound, I can usually get over it because that's my only, like, I was there when it was born, right? So I got this album the day after it came out. This is the way it was. But if I came to it decades later, as I did with both these two albums, I was not into Emerson, Lake and Palmer hardcore when I was in college, wasn't checking them out. So I did not hear these albums until like decades later. Came out in what, 92 and 94, I think, were their last two albums, something like that. And so the production I was just never able to get over with. Of the two, I do think Black Moon is a little bit better. In the hot seat from the beginning, the drums are just bad. There's a song called, what is it, Daddy something. Kind of sounds like a lukewarm Dire Straits song, at least at the end, which kind of redeems it. Has this sort of, one of those sort of loping, what is it, it's Daddy. Straight up devastating lyrics about, it's just devastating lyrics and emotional, just a weird little song. But the vibe is kind of a Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms, didn't make the cut vibe. So musically, slightly redeemable in a weird way. One by One has some moments that work musically, but the sort of the melodies, there's nothing there to hook you into it. Emerson is always has weird indulgent moments on In the Hot Seat, but for the most part, it's just, there's nothing there that interests me. Black Moon works a little bit better. Lake's voice in particular, I've never been a big fan of Lake's voice. For me, it's almost like I can't get over him not being in those first two King Crimson albums. And like everything else, I'm like, you either need to be harder and more King Crimson-y, or you need to be smoother and more John Wetton-y. Always bring me back to those first two Asia albums for some reason. So Lake's voice has never been a draw for me. And on Black Moon, it's just like, it's not even Lake. He's lost a lot of something. Again, good Emerson moments on Black Moon. Affair of the Heart has a nice sort of 70s acoustic vibe, like a Harry Chapin, almost Janis Ian type thing, which for some reason works. Romeo and Juliet is an instrumental with a good vibe. The kind of haunting, stomping. There's a Dumbo Elephants on Parade type indulgent vibe on this. A lot of like Emerson's late period stuff, when he's like kind of really experimenting or getting a little more proggy, there is a very Disney element to it, but it is that darker 60s psychedelic Disney, so it kind of works. Still saying proggy and kind of trippy, but for the most part, these two albums, just the production kills me. But that's it. Yeah, I'm rambling on about two albums I will probably never listen to again, but that's number 10 and number 9. On to number 8. Number 8 is their 7th album, Love Beach. Let's put that album cover back on there. There it is. This came out in 1978 in the height of disco. Bee Gees ruling the world. This album is not as bad as, I would argue, this album is not as bad as this album demands that this album cover demands it must be. It's not the best Emerson, Lake and Palmer album, but if you were listening to it and didn't know who it was, maybe you might enjoy it. Yeah, the opening, All I Want Is You, again, I'm getting some Asia vibes. I'm getting some Wettin vibes, which I got those in some of the not that good Yes albums that I recently did. So it's interesting that Asia keeps popping up in a good way. I haven't listened to Asia for decades, but again, I'm getting some Asia vibes. Love Beach, the title track, is kind of a good poppy 70s song. Kind of reminds me of Squeeze at times. If like the Squeeze guys, if Chris was singing this, I think it would sound like Squeeze. Kind of interesting. Taste of My Love, despite having some of the worst lyrics ELP's done, I think Ian Gillan could pull them off from Deep Purple because he had a way of being kind of sleazy and sexual, but it felt funny and just like rock and roll in the best way possible. I don't think Lake pulls it off as well, but there's kind of a nice dark musical energy to the song that I like. The Gambler, not even sure what's happening here. There are these background singers that come in that are just befuddling, like what in the world is happening? For You starts off kind of proggier and slower, has a nice kind of eerie tone. Canaria is an instrumental Emerson showcase. It sounds, again, the Disney vibe, only it's like the Disney meets, I want to say the Pogues, but more like who's like a not punk version of the Pogues, but kind of a jaunty Irish pubby type vibe. Um, and then the sort of the epic of the album that closes, I think it's all of side B, if I'm not mistaken, side two. This 20-minute memoirs of an officer and a gentleman, which I'd like to think inspired the movie. The Deborah Winger loved this song and pitched it to somebody and was like, let's make a movie out of it. I don't think that's how it happened. Can't say it really does not much for me. It's like the first 11 minutes is a little bit slower, balladier, a lot of piano, and then we kind of get jauntier around the 11-minute mark. Gets a little bounce. It's not the worst thing they've done. It's not the best thing they've done. It's they're attempting to be a little more proggy, but other than the cover, this is not a bad album. Is it a good Emerson, Lake and Palmer album? Probably not, other than Canaria, which kind of rocks. But it's not a bad late 70s album. There are far worse things out there. But that cover, man, oh, that cover. On to number 7. My number 7 is their 6th Works Volume 2. Obviously a follow-up to Works Volume 1. Sort of an odds and sodsy type collection of like things recorded back in 73, outtakes from other albums, B-sides, singles, all kinds of stuff like that. And a pretty eclectic collection. I think the side A is really strong, or the first side is really strong. The second side is a little more whimsical and indulgent in a way that doesn't interest me. But Tiger in a Spotlight is nice, good sort of like, I don't know, rocker type number. What did I call it? It reminded me of something, and I wrote it in my notes. Sort of reminds me of that song. I think it's the Manhattan Transfer, the boy from New York City. This dun 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 dun, dun, almost like a let's go crazy, but just like a poppier, like it's not going to erupt into a crazy guitar solo at the end, sadly. So that's kind of an interesting, weird little vibe that somehow works. When the apple blossoms bloom in the windmills of your mind, I'll be your Valentine. A B-side from Jerusalem. Kind of sounds like a modern day jam band, just led by like a keyboard player. It's actually pretty good. Bullfrog is kind of funky, weird all over the place. Brain Salad Surgery, which was left off that album. I think I read somewhere or saw a documentary where they left it off that album because they didn't want anybody to think the album was named after the song. Would have worked great on the album. I think would have really... I have an issue with that album because in the CD version, it doesn't work as well as it did back in the vinyl days because of the way the first movement is divided up. But I think Brain Salad Surgery could have worked well somewhere on that, in that sort of Carnival 9 multi-movement thing. It feels right at home there musically. But that's a neat song. Barrel House Shakedown, this is the stuff that doesn't do it for me. These sort of indulgent type, like sort of other musical genre things. Barrel House Shakedown doesn't do it for me. Maple Leaf Rag. I don't really need Leg to, and I Believe in Father Christmas, though it is a pretty good performance. Honky Tonk Train Blues. Show me the way to go home. Tired and I want to go to bed. Isn't that from Jaws? Isn't that what they're singing in Jaws when right before Bruce hits the boat after they're telling their scar stories? But some other good stuff on here. So Far to Fall has some kind of dark energy. Close But Not Touching is a very nice sort of Carlos Santana-esque vibe to it. And then Watching Over You kind of feels like a Gordon Lightfoot song. Yeah, so that's that. But anyways, not a bad album. Again, it's not your heavy prog stuff. There's a couple proggy indulgent moments, but I think it's a good eclectic sort of fun album as an odds and sods thing. It's definitely not bad. But that would be my number 7, Works 2. Number 6 is Works Volume 1. This came out in 1977. And this, mad respect for the whole concept, though I don't think it's obviously executed very well. Well, it's not. It's number 6 executed well. But each of the 3 members would get their own side of music. And then the 4th side would be collaborative. Talk about just indulgent prog stuff. Apparently, Yes had that year, previous year, like a bunch of members of Yes had released solo albums and they didn't do so well. So this band was going to do that, but they're like, hey, we need to sell records, so let's just put let's make a solo side of music, and then we'll like do that, right? So there was a of philosophy, commercial philosophy, possibly driving this. And it doesn't all work. In fact, I probably should rank this lower on the list because I only like half the album. But I so admire the audacity. And I have lots of thoughts on it, so I'm going to go quickly. Side A is the Keith Emerson album. It's his 18-minute and 18-second movement of classical music. To me, it sounds like feel-good Disney music from the 60s or 70s, like Escape from Witch Mountain, the triumphant ending, ta-da, the orchestra comes in. So Escape from Witch Mountain did have some cool, non-triumphant, kind of scary music in it. Like Bedknobs and Broomsticks or something like that. It just sounds like a Disney live action movie from the 60s or 70s, and this is sort of the triumphant classical music that comes with it. I cannot help but compare this to Frank Zappa's Gregory Peccary, which this came out in 77, and Frank had already performed Gregory Peccary. He had performed it with a band, had performed it with an orchestra, but had not yet released it. And I'm thinking that, I'd like to think that there's a world, and maybe this is the world we live in, is Frank heard this and was like, what? I need to get Gregory out now because I have a version of a complete side of music that's sort of an orchestral, classical, ambitious thing. Only I got weird voices in it, and there's a pig, and I think it's almost like Frank was like, I got to get that out now and show the world that I'm doing this stuff too, because it's interesting, the sort of Frank's complete risk-taking on Gregory, which I think Emerson's is a pretty safe, not too adventurous. There are nice moments. The piano playing is fantastic, but ultimately it doesn't do anything for me. Side 2 is Greg Lake's side. And other than Hallowed Be Thy Name, the middle song, which is a really kind of nice, kind of really dirty, I don't want to say dirty, but kind of low-key, funky groove. Nothing on this side really does anything for me. It's all just Greg Lake being Greg Lake, sort of that softer side of Greg Lake. And I'm not a big fan of his voice or his songwriting for the most part. So this side doesn't really do anything for me. And then we get side 3, which is the Carl Palmer side. And my thought is Carl Palmer was like, what? The drummer gets an entire side of music? I'm coming in like gangbusters. And that first song on here, The Enemy God Dances with the Black Spirits, which is a cover of a I'm not going to mispronounce this guy's name. Prokofiev? Never mind. That guy. It just comes in like gangbusters. And it's just audacious. It sounds like he's riding on elephants and like there's a full it's just the most fantastic opening to a side of music ever. And at the end of coming after the first 2 sides, it's just bombastic, galore, amazing. Everything on this is jammy and loose and fun. There's sort of a remake of Tank, but without the drum solo from the first album, which essentially felt like a Moby Dick drum solo vehicle. Here we just get a nice, good reworked version of Tank. What else do we have? Joe Walsh is on here. Really nice guitar solo on, what is that? Los Angeles Night Song. It's a really hyper propulsive, jazzy type feel. New Orleans has a forced, somewhat stilted New Orleans vibe. Like this band is not as loose and funky as it wants to be, but they're trying. Food for Your Soul has just like some super aggressive 70s theme show type action. Tank is it feels a little more darker and more intense. Definitely than everything that came before it. Just really, really good stuff. Like Palmer hits it out of the ballpark with this. And really, this should have been just a single album, Palmer side and then side B. Side B, we get Fanfare for the Common Man, cover of the Copland song. Just absolutely fantastic. This is just a driving, propulsive jam the entire time. And then we get the Trainwreck, I'm not even sure what this is, Pirates. It's at times it sounds like we're sailing the high seas in a Disney movie. Then things get weird and they get proggy, and then we have some good moments, and then it sounds like Asia, and then it sounds like Billy Joel. Like it is, Pirates is the most, like it, I don't like it, yet at the same time I really, really do like it. It is cheesy. It is, I'm not even sure how to describe it. At times, I think it's some of the worst things they've done. At times, I'm like, oh, this is absolutely beautiful. So I'm all over the map on what I think of Pirates, but coming at the end of whatever else was this this collection of songs is. But I have one more thing to say about this. I'm going on long. It reminds me of the movie The Twilight Zone, by the one that was directed by back in the day with the 4 different directors, and 4 stories on there. The first 2 stories kind of don't do anything for me, but I think reflect this. The first story is like a straightforward Twilight Zone. Bigot goes back in time to the era in which he was most bigoted against, right? Your typical Twilight Zone story. The beats are there, but for some reason it's just lacking. It's lacking something, possibly due to the horrific accident that killed 3 people while filming that, and they had to work around that and released it anyway. And this first side of Emerson's feels like it's just lacking something. And then the second movie on that was the Kick the Can one, which kind of reminds me of Greg Lake's side. It's just kind of, whatever. Okay, it's there. It's kind of cute and quaint. Then you get the third movie in the Twilight Zone, the third thing, and that's the one with the boy who's got the powers, and you got these weird cartoon effects, and it's crazy, psychedelic, and you're not even sure if it's good or not, but it is so colorful and weird and out there that you're highly entertained. That's the Carl Palmer side. And then, for the last part, the movie might be a little bit better than the actual album, but the final scene in that movie, the John Lithgow on the airplane scene, seeing the gremlin, is just hit it out of the ballpark. We figured out what we do best. And that's kind of like what fanfare for the common man is. Pirates kind of ruins this narrative, but Pirates at least is them as a group trying to do something weird, and it might be a train wreck, but it's an intriguing train wreck. But anyways, a fascinating, fascinating album. My number 6, Works Volume 1. Number 5 is their 4th album, Brain Salad Surgery, and you did notice the sort of pornographic imagery in the title, in the cover, right? That's sort of showing you what brain salad surgery is in reference to. It's there. Look again. But anyways, this is their 4th album. This is where they're winning the album cover wars, hitting it out of the ballpark, giving Giger his, showing the world what a talented artist H.R. Giger was. But yeah, great album. We're now in that sort of, I think I would argue that any of these next 5 albums on this list could be anybody's number 1. And I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense to me. Opens up with Jerusalem, which I'm not ever been a big fan of. My biggest problem with a lot of Emerson, Lake and Palmer albums is I don't think the lead-off tracks are always their best. And this is, I don't think, one of their best lead-off tracks. Toccata, an adaptation of a piano concerto by Alberto Ginastera. Right? Fantastic. This is prog craziness. Almost has like a modern industrial sound that is just fantastic. It's aggressive. We got a drum solo in there. We get calm and eerie and like almost sounds like a Space Invaders video game vibe towards the end of it. Just hit it out of the ballpark all the way. Still You Turn Me On. It's got to get chided for the line, "Someone get me a ladder," or how Greg delivers the "Someone get me a ladder," but that's got some some really good sort of one of Greg Legg's better sort of slower acoustic numbers. Got some good little playing in there, but lyrically that "Someone get me a ladder" line kills me every time. Benny the Bouncer I could do without. Sounds like something Keith Moon would be singing. And then on side 1, and this is where the CD age kind of affects this album in a weird way. So closing out side 1, you get Carnival 9, The First Impression, Part 1, which is like 8 minutes long, which is an absolutely fantastic piece of prog music. Just you're all over the map. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, prog instrumental passages, some prog songs, some prog energy, some prog jams. The song that we know as Carnival 9, the big hit, is Part 2. And around the 3.5 minute mark of Part 1, you start to get your first sort of melodic ties in references to Part 2. Like you get those first sort of like themes that would occur in the single. And then a couple minutes later, you essentially get a somewhat different, slightly like alternative, like multiple reality, alternative universe version of the single with slightly different lyrics, slightly different breaks. You get a solo that's almost exactly the same, if not the same. And so it's this weird, almost like mirror image, but it's almost like that movie. I don't want to give anything away. Spoiler alert. to Jordan Peele fans. It's almost like an Us version of Carnival 9 Part 2. And that's to end side one. And it's fantastic. It's like all you need. I'm not even sure you need Carnival 9 Part 2. But then you have the album flip. And so you get Carnival 9 First Impression Part 2, which is like that 4:47-minute, that 5-minute single that we all know from the band, which is prog rock boiled down to 5 minutes. It's an absolutely perfect example of progressive rock. But I'm not sure it's needed. Like, it's needed when you have the album flip because you're calling back to that. But when you're listening to it on a CD, it's like, wait a minute, didn't we just hear this? I almost think Benny the Bouncer, like if we had been in the CD age, Benny the Bouncer should have, not Benny the Bouncer, the Brain Salad Surgery, the title track should have occurred here. And then Carnival 9 First Impression Part 2 actually should have been after the third impression to sort of close out the album. I think that would have made a better album. The second impression is a lot jazzier and more like way low key and stuff like that. And then the third impression, I think, is the one that still you're kind of big and it's bombastic and you're going more for hitting it out of the park with the prog stuff. But it feels the weakest of the three and kind of not important. It's almost like they just felt like they needed to close it out. And it definitely doesn't have the energy of like part one, which is just for the first movement, I mean, which both those parts are fantastic. Really nice sort of Morse code jam at one point where they're doing this really neat like hyper prog jam in part three, the third movement. But I think that third movement is probably the weakest and maybe needed something to follow it at the end. But yeah, a great album. Like if you had this as your number one, I can understand why. But I do just have some complaints, especially in this CD age. But anyways, that is my number 5, Brain Salad Surgery. My number 4 is their third album, Trilogy. I would say another head-scratching album cover. Another really good album. I would say it drops down to here for me is because, again, I don't think the opening track is the strongest on here. It opens up with sort of a 3-part, just prog rock, awesome attack. I mean, it's great that they're attacking from the beginning. I just don't think the material is as strong on this as it is on some other albums. But the Endless Enigma into a fugue into sort of Endless Enigma Part 2, that whole thing's about 10 minutes long. It's a good, solid opening, but I don't think it's as epic as some of the stuff on the next 3 albums. From the beginning, another one of those Greg Lake sort of acoustic ballady things that has some absolutely fantastic Emerson keyboard playing on it that just gives it an eerie quality. The contrast between like Lake's sort of do-do-do-do vibe and like Emerson's creepy keyboards at the end is just hit it out of the ballpark. Fantastic. Sheriff is a weird little song that closes out, that doesn't close out the side, but kind of leads into the hoedown. And the Sheriff kind of reminds me of them covering a song off Elton John's Tumbleweed Connection. Has that sort of Americana country-ish type vibe that Tumbleweed Connection has. And it sounds like them doing their take on one of those songs. There's definitely some Emerson prog elements in the keys. But it's a neat little vibe, and I actually kind of like it. And it's weird, but it works. And then that goes into Hoedown, which is their interpretation of Aaron Copland's Showdown. And it is just like silliness from the beginning. And it's an arrangement of Hoedown, not Showdown. It's an arrangement of Hoedown. For some reason I thought the arrangement was called Showdown. But yeah, it's just an absolute just fun track. It's just fun. It's just them fun. They would open up their shows with it. It's just a fun little instrumental. And then side 2, you get Trilogy, which is kind of Emerson served 3 ways, right? That's kind of a theme on another album that's coming up. You get a soft, delicate piece that opens up, switches gear into sort of maybe an awesome, heavier, groovier piece. And then we close out with this loose, swaying, almost island-flavored jam at the end. Living Sin is just a weird, dark, proggy number. Kind of reminds me of ZZ Top's. I think it's Deguello. That just weird, like, when they do all that weird, like, effects and stuff in one of those late 70s ZZ Top albums. And then it closes with Abaddon's Bolero, which is a bolero. It's fantastic. I think every prog band probably needs to deliver a bolero at some point. it does what I think is required, and then it slowly gets louder in volume as we enter. You can't just start off with loud volume. You got to mess with people's minds first. Great closer to an album. Absolutely fantastic. Could be longer. At 8 minutes, I wish it went on for like 15. This is something I'd really like to see the band stretch out and do. But yeah, fantastic album. Really fun. I really don't think there's a bad song on here. I just think there are stronger material on the three that remain. But that's my number 4, Trilogy. My number 3 is their first album, their self-titled Emerson, Lake and Palmer, came out in 1970. Another just really, really strong album. Opens up with a interpretation of Bartók's Allegro Barbaro, which apparently is a piano piece, but they call it the Barbarian, and they just attack with full-on prog attack energy. A great debut song. I don't know if it ranks up there as one of the all-time great first song you'd ever hear from a band, but it might be eligible for that discussion. But it's a really good, just hit it out of the ballpark, prog, full-on attack. This is what this band can do. Followed up by like a 12.5-minute Take a Pebble. Starts off a little for me, the sort of piano ballady energy that starts off. Doesn't really engage me. I think it's just one of those sort of lake melodies that I'm not like getting into. But then we go in through all these sort of proggy different parts. Things get jammy, then things get really quiet. Then we have this weird little diversion with like piped in like audience noise, and then we get a really nice jam towards the end. So the song kind of reminds me of like ambient Fish, like maybe 2000 era Fish at times. You can definitely hear like jam band flavors in here. So not a bad song, but I don't think it's a consistently hit it out of the ballpark song. Knife Edge, really nice, just aggressive, sort of like prog attack song. I think it's an interpretation of a Bach song. The Three Fates, again, this is sort of Emerson in three ways. We get organ fate, we get piano fate, we get sort of jam, the full band comes in, a little bit jazzier fate. So we get the Three Fates. We get Tank, which is like sort of the Moby Dick of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. We get a really, really nice instrumental proggy thing. Then we get a drum solo. Then we go back to this really, really nice, awesome instrumental thing. And then we close out with Lucky Man, which I would say from the beginning is probably my favorite of the big three. Still You Turn Me On, Lucky Man from the beginning of the actual compositions. But this is another one where you get the song, and it's never been one of my favorite, but that Emerson keyboard solo at the end and Palmer's drumming are just so fantastic on the song that it ends the album with a really nice little flavor. Great debut album. I think it clearly, we get the full-on attack with Barbarian, Knife Edge, Tank to some degree. We get the sort of prog experimental stuff with the Three Fates and Take a Pebble. We get the Greg Lake ballad with Lucky Man. We get a little bit of everything that they would bring forth always from this point, or on the good stuff from this point. But yeah, that's my number 3, their first album. Number 2 is Pictures at an Exhibition. This is their third album, first live album. And it is their adaptation, interpolation of Mussorgsky's Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition live. This is perfect. While I do have one album I like a little bit better, I think this is like prog rock perfection. Like this is what prog rock should be. Indulgent, a classical piece interpreted for rock. It's just pretty much nothing but just a full-on attack and a full-on jam the entire time. Opens up with Promenade, which sets the tone in a way that's completely misleading, because it's like you get like a nice like pipe organ solo come in and everything's like, oh, it's going to be this classical music. And then the gnome comes in and we're just in full-on prog attack, go at you hard mode. It is exhilarating. It is such a great sort of contrast between like, I don't know, if you're an Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan and they start this off and you've never heard it and they start off with that pipe organ swell, maybe you're thinking it's just going to be a little more traditional, but bam, they hit you with the gnome. If I have a complaint, it's that the Sage, which is like the low key sort of Greg Lake, bring things down to a simmer kind of vibe. Should have come later on the album. I don't know if this is, I mean, obviously this might be sequenced for a reason, but I do think that there's nothing else on this rest of the album that brings the vibe down as low as the Sage does, and it feels like it's just coming too early in the album. Other than that, it's perfect. So we get another promenade into the Sage. Sage goes into the Old Castle. The Old Castle kind of starts off a little like a little more like light and airy, kind of tying into the Sage, and then we kind of drop into a jam, and that full jam goes straight into like blues variation, which is like this just like 12-bar blues jam that apparently like is referencing things from like the Old Castle. That goes into another promenade, full group, big version of Promenade, which drops into the best 3-song run on this album. One of the best 3-song runs they've ever played. I'm going to do a top 10 song list after this, and I want to include all 3 songs as one, but you get the Hut of Baba Yaga into the Curse of Baba Yaga, back into the Hut of Baba Yaga, and the Hut is just this like really aggressive, sort of very like just go at it, attack energy, kind of like negative, kind of not negative, but kind of like dark. And then when we get into like the Curse, things get more dramatic, and we get more like you can feel the Curse coming on, and then we go back into the attack. Just some of their best playing. And the fact that it's all live is what I think makes it even better. Then we go into the Great Gates of Kiev as sort of a closer to the main set. And then my only complaint about the album, it's just an all-around silly, silly song, is the album closes out with a bunch of Nutcracker themes, sort of reinterpreted as something called Nut Rocker. And it's right up there with something maybe the Trans-Siberian Orchestra should do, if they don't already do it. I've never seen Trans-Siberian Orchestra. But yeah, sorry if I mispronounced Mussorgsky. Mussorgsky? That's the guy. Pictures at an exhibition. I love this album. Great. A great, awesome prog rock document. This should be in a prog rock capsule somewhere. My number 2, Pictures at an Exhibition. And my number 1 Emerson, Lake and Palmer album is their second release, Tarkus. Once again, winning the album cover battle right there. And while that's up, look at that. Look at that thing on there. That's what the title track, side A, all, 20 minutes of it, maybe more, 20 minutes and 59 seconds of it. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like that machine. It is one long, proggy piece that, like a lot of other prog pieces from like bands in this era, like Close to the Edge, Supper's Ready, any other number of Yes things up Topographic Oceans, King Crimson pieces, you really feel like there's like 8 different parts on Tarkus as far as like it's indexed. It's like you get Tarkus, you get Eruption, Stones of Years, Iconoclast, Mass, Manticore, Battlefield, and Aquatarkus, right? You get these like subsections. And if you're listening to the song, you can kind of tell where those start, but they're not these incredible shifts in tone or direction or instrumentation. They all seem to flow together pretty well in the sense that it looks like that beast. It's just this big, lumbering, full-on attacking prog rock, just assault. And it is amazing. I think it is one of the most cohesive, by far, 20-minute prog pieces anybody's ever produced. Somewhere in there, I want to say it's right at the beginning of Mass. I have to do the math on that. Maybe before Mass, maybe it's the end of Iconoclast. There's a riff that kind of sounds like apostrophe, but it just, and it resolves differently than that, but it starts off with that bom, 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 but then it goes somewhere different. Reminds me of apostrophe, gets a little light in the feet for a while. But it is just a perfect little prog rock 20 minutes. Electric guitar gets some love. Emerson is all over the place. We got some super proggy parts early on. Like, if you were looking at sort of the inner machinations of this machine that's on the cover, like parts of it sound like you're watching it just like go, and it's just, it is an exhilarating 20-minute ride to open up this album. That is all of side A. Side B is 6 songs that are all much shorter, but for the most part, all work really, really well. And I think complement Tarkus really, really well, the title track. Jeremy Bender, kind of a light throwaway, less than 2 minute number. Bitches Crystal, awesome, just full on prog hard rock attack. The Only Way, starts, it's a hymn, starts off kind of soft and gentle. We get some lyrics, it kind of builds a little bit of fanfare, and then we kind of slide into Infinite Space, which is this awesome instrumental jam that is just fantastic. Absolutely fun. Then that goes into very herky-jerky energy, got a really good flow to it. That goes into A Time and a Place, which is a really nice heavy rocker. And then we get, like, to close out, probably the only throwaway tune on here, the sort of 50s rocker, Are You Ready, Eddie, sort of a, like a early Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis type, that kind of rock energy type stuff. Kind of a silly little song. But it works because we open up with heaviness and close with like a callback to like 50s rock. I don't know, something about it. My favorite album. I think Tarkus is hands down the best thing they've ever done as far as a single song goes. So to give away another list that's coming in a couple days. But yeah, that's it. That's my number one, their second album, Tarkus. And that is what my list looks like in writing, my ranking of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's albums. Let me know your ranking. Let me know why Love Beach deserves to be ranked higher. I don't know. Anyways, I would say any of those top 5, I would understand if you had those, if anybody had those at number 1, because I think they're all pretty consistent and also in a way kind of inconsistent. Though I like Tarkus the more because that title track is bomb, baby. Anyways, thanks for watching. That's all I got. Subscribe, like, share, and go listen to Tarkus. If you're not familiar with Tarkus and you're a prog rock fan, go listen to Tarkus. That title track is bomb, people. I'm going to keep saying the word bomb, people. It's winter here in Texas now, people. That sucks. All right. Peace. Talk to you later. Stay warm. Listen to music. Tarkus.